Hi, I'm Sarah Jones. Welcome to this digital edition of the Northern Ireland Science Festival. We're delighted to have Jenny Kleeman in conversation with Hugh Odling-Smee on her book Sex Robots and Vegan Meat. Please make sure to click like and subscribe to keep up to date with all of the events. Big thanks to our panellists today.
All right, hello everybody. My name's Hugh Odling-Smee and welcome to this Northern Ireland Science Festival event. While I'm speaking to you down the line, I'm very delighted that Jenny Kleeman has joined us. Hello, Jenny.
Hello, very happy to be here.
Indeed, in the virtual ether here. And we're going to be discussing this brilliant book that you have written, with the title of which is Sex Robots and Vegan Meat. Come for the sex robots and stay for the vegan meat, I think is the kind of thrust of it. Adventures at the frontier of birth, food, sex and death. It's a brilliant book, fascinating book. And so thank you very much for joining us to talk about it today. Where are you, just so we can place you for the audience?
I am in my kitchen / living room in London.
Gorgeous, and I'm afraid I've got very boring kind of doors behind me. You've got a lovely selection of different books there, different titles and things.
Yes,
is that the American?
That's the American one. That's the
right.
that's the British one, and the orange one there is in fact the Russian one that just arrived a couple of days ago, which is hilarious. It's basically the same cover as the British one, but in Russian with the sex robots with much thinner waists.
You're going to read a bit, but just to ask you a question about what it's like to launch a book in the midst of a pandemic as a writer. How's it going?
Well, I found it really difficult. A lot of writers are introverts. I'm not. I spent 5 years writing this book, and I wrote most of it. Well, I wrote all of it in my bedroom upstairs where I have my desk. And I was dreaming of this time where I would emerge like a swan into the real world and talk to real people about it and get dressed up and, you know, put some high heels on. So I have really missed doing events like this in person, because what's wonderful is not just doing these events and taking questions from the floor, but it's all those interactions you have afterwards, all those little chats. That's where you get so many ideas as a journalist and as a writer. So I found that really hard. And also, you know, my book has a big bright cover and a big flashy title, and it was kind of designed to be the sort of thing that catches your eye in a bookshop. So it's painful to me to think that not many people have been able to see it on bookshop tables. I found that hard, but the response to it has been lovely. I've got used to doing events like this. So it's been okay, but for someone like me, I was really looking forward to emerging into the world with my book in my hand.
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking for both of us, you know, we would both love to be doing this in person in a big packed room, and you know, and I think you always miss the energy of an audience and the kind of engagement, especially with nonfiction, actually, because so many people bring their own stories and their own kind of experiences to things as well. Well, you're going to be kind enough to read an extract, and so have at it whenever you're ready.
The extract I'm going to read is from the first chapter of the book, and it's about when I was given a tour of the workroom in Abyss Creations. Abyss Creations make Real Doll, which are the world's best known hyper-realistic silicone sex dolls. And these dolls are very expensive. They cost, you know, from about $6,000 for a very basic model to anything up to $50,000 or beyond. And this is a bit about where I first saw how they were made. A long queue of headless bodies hang on metal chains from a track in the ceiling, like carcasses in an abattoir. Their fingers and legs are splayed. Their chests jut forwards and their hips are thrust back. Each one is different to the next. Some have cartoonish pendular breasts, others have athletic bodies, but they all share the same impossibly tiny waists. Because they're hanging, they are moving, dangling eerily a few feet above a floor littered with gummy silicone offcuts that look like flakes of dead skin. You can touch them, no problem, Dakota says. He slaps one hard on the bottom. Sounds just like a human. It does. It makes me flinch. The skin is the most unnerving thing of all about these headless bodies. Made of a custom blend of medical grade platinum silicone in a range of tones from fair to cocoa, It feels like human flesh with the same friction and resistance, but it's cold. The hands have lines, folds, wrinkles, knuckles, veins. When I intertwine the fingers of one in my hand, I can feel the crunch of the skeleton underneath, with joints just like bones. Hands are the hardest thing to sculpt, Dakota tells me. We usually mold them off a real human's hands. He stops to take a close look at a few. Actually, some of these hands belong to my ex-girlfriend. There are 42 different shades of nipple in a spectrum of 10 possible shades. They're displayed in a matrix on what Dakota calls the nipple wall, with names like standard, puffy, and half dome, and range from the most popular, perky 1 and perky 2, small, erect, unimaginative, to the distinctly niche, custom 2, an areola as large as a saucer. Customers sometimes send in pictures of their perfect nipple or labia, which Abyss will recreate for a fee. Are people's sexual choices really that specific? I ask. Dakota laughs. People's choices are way more specific than this. Sometimes people even get down to where they want each individual freckle on the body. We stop next to a corkboard with swathes of synthetic pubic hair pinned to it. Unnervingly convincing acrylic eyeballs with hand-painted capillaries stare out at us from plastic tubs. In theory, you could ask for the face of your ex, couldn't you? I ask. You'd have to send us photos, and then we'd ask, who is this? And do you have their permission? We definitely ask for proof of permission. We turn down a lot of requests, but if you have specific permission from the person, we can pretty much mimic anything. Almost all our business comes from customers sending us photos of what they like. I've been here an hour and nothing seems strange anymore, but something truly extraordinary is being made in a room along the corridor. The most ambitious creation ever to be developed at Abyss is called Harmony, and she is the culmination of 20 years of Matt McMullen's work making sex toys, 5 years of research and development into animatronics and artificial intelligence, and hundreds of thousands of dollars of Matt's own money. She is a real doll brought to life, a real doll with a personality, a real doll who can move and speak and remember. She is a sex robot. And after a year of emails and phone calls, I've finally been granted permission to meet her.
My goodness. Thank you, Jenny. And as ever, if we were in a full room, there'd be a round of applause, of course.
Thank you.
It's a really quite, that's the first bit of the book, isn't it?
Yes.
And so it really sets up for this crazy journey around these crazy people and their kind of crazy but understandable ideas. You're a long-time journalist. You've done a lot of work in both TV and in writing and magazines and things like that. How then did this book come about?
The book started as a selection of articles. So the book is in 4 sections: birth, food, sex, and death. And it's about one invention that will affect each of those pillars of human experience. And it began with death. So I began looking at these radical right to die groups. I began investigating those. I wrote a piece for The Guardian on one of those groups, but I kept following them for many years. Yeah. And then I discovered the world of sex robots. And once I had written an article about sex robots and death, I thought birth, food, sex, and death, those are the 4 pillars of human experience. I'm going to write a book about this. And it's interesting because my background in television means that I kind of approach all these stories as if I were making a documentary. That instead of interviewing people across a desk or over the phone, I'm always trying to have encounters with people, and I'm always trying to get people to be active and to show me stuff. And I'm always thinking about painting a very visual picture, making a scene, basically. So the book comes from, well, the genesis of the book is a few articles that I wrote, but the approach is actually very much informed by my work in television.
Right, okay. So it's about seeing people in their own environment.
It's about seeing people in their own environment, but also when you're making a piece of television, you are always trying to make a point visually. You're trying to make a point with actuality. You're trying to let the viewer make up their own mind on the basis of what they see, rather than what you are saying in the voiceover. And it's the same sort of thing. So it's about when you are coming up with a scenario to interview someone in, you don't just think I'll give them a call or I'll go and see them in their office. You think, where can we go together that will illuminate something about their character and make for an interesting scene?
Yeah. So when you meet Matt in his factory, the fact that you're in the presence, or well, Dakota takes you on the tour. You're in the presence of the actual objects themselves.
Yes.
And you seem to have a very good ear for how people describe what they're doing as well. I mean, just in that short extract, the way that he talks about it and the nervousness about it.
Yes.
Like, oh, actually, these are some of my ex-girlfriend's hands, and then he goes on to say, well, of course, we'd have to check out if he could do, the sort of, what's the word, the real taboo stuff that hangs in the air. All through all four different sections of the book, the taboos that are being pushed and things like that. The way that people talk about it is very interesting. I got this whenever you were writing about and sort of recounting the conversations you had, it reminded me a lot of Spinal Tap. In the scene where he's talking about his amps, his special amps that he's got built. And so Rob Reiner says, well, why don't you just make 10 louder? And he says, well, these go all the way up to 11, as if, that makes perfect sense. And why would you not understand it? And there was a lot of that within some of your interviewees, there's this sense of, well, of course, but this is how it is. This is how it's going to be. And the sort of the level of understanding that you brought about humanity and things was just absent in their answer. It was very, very, very interesting, very telling. Sorry, I went off on the Spinal Tap comparison there, but those four areas, birth, food, sex, and death. Was there anything else that you thought about? Were there any other areas that you looked at? I don't know, democracy or?
No, I mean, I picked birth, food, sex, and death because it is they're the universal pillars of human experience. We all emerge from our mother's body. We seek out sexual relationships with other human beings. We generally live off the flesh of dead animals until we die, in a death that none of us can control or predict. The question for me was, which inventions was I going to focus on in those areas? Because if you're talking about birth, food, sex, and death, there is a lot in all of those spheres when it comes to technological innovation. But what I ended up being drawn to was people who say they are solving fundamental human problems with technology. And quite often these are problems that we could actually solve ourselves by changing our behavior, but entrepreneurs are offering us a technological solution instead. So, people who are saying, what if you could have babies without anyone being pregnant? How would that change the world? How would that make the world a better place? What if we could eat meat without killing animals? What if you could have a painless, perfect death at the time of your own choosing? And all of these things are very alluring because we are really scared about how little control we actually have over the natural world. And in fact, that is really, in this year of COVID, you can really see that as much as we like to kid ourselves that we're in control of things, we're absolutely at the mercy of forces that we can't control. So birth, food, sex, and death are the kind of four pillars of human experience that have largely been beyond our control until now. And I feel like we're at this critical point in our history where technology is, to some degree, giving us a sense of control or a degree of control over those areas. And I wanted to look at what are the unintended consequences of trying to control what makes us human.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, that makes absolute sense in terms of how, I think the way that you describe, kind of our control, and all the people in the book seem to be grasping for control and grasping for, that sort of the next summit. But it always feels a long way away. I mean, one of the things that was quite interesting, and I mentioned this earlier on about startups and the startup culture that you come across. So many of these people are engaged in sort of entrepreneurship and startups, that you often feel, and you mentioned this a couple of times in the book, that actually these things are a long way off. These inventions feel close because they feel understandable, but they actually are, the reality of them is a long way off. Are we all going to have a sex robot in the house in a year? It's probably pretty unlikely.
A large part of the book was about hype. So it was about the stories that entrepreneurs want to tell and the stories that we want to hear. Because there's a real appetite, we've all been raised on science fiction to a degree. All of these things that I look at are tropes of science fiction. There are antecedents of all of these ideas in fiction. So they're not such foreign ideas. The idea of a robot that you can fall in love with and have a relationship with. So part of the book was about kind of delving into that and also puncturing that, because a lot of journalists want to tell that story. It's a really, really entertaining story. Like, very soon you'll be able to eat a steak and it will be completely no different from a steak that comes from a cow, but it will have been grown in a petri dish. Yeah. Or, you know, you're going to be able to create your perfect partner. The reality of all of it is that the 4 inventions that I look at in the book, which are meat grown in labs, sex robots, artificial wombs, and euthanasia machines, they are all going to exist one day. Yeah. When is another matter. So some of them were really quite far off them actually existing, but they are going to exist. We're definitely on a path that we're not going to be able to retreat from in terms of innovation. Yeah. And any obstacles will be ethical and legal rather than technological. Sex robots are already on the market. Harmony, the sex robot who I interview in the book, you can already buy her. Well, you can buy a robotic head that you put on a sex doll body. So the head can talk and move, and the head has artificial intelligence. But the idea of having a robot that delivers herself to your front door, knocks on the door and says, hello, I'm your new girlfriend, we're really quite far off that. But that will happen one day.
Well, I suppose that's good to know. I'm not sure if that, you know, so this is the question that the whole book throws up, is this idea: is this progress, or is this simply just circumventing, you know, issues that we find in our life by using technology to do it? And I was thinking about different kinds of technology. You know, is the car a bad? Well, it is. It has had bad consequences, but it's also had good things. It's also brought, you know, kind of positive progress as well. How do you feel about the inventions that you meet and the ethical dilemmas that you come across? Are they about progression, or are they about commerce, I suppose?
Well, I mean, the thing about most of the inventions, certainly if you look at artificial wombs or you look at meat grown in labs, is that there is undeniably positive applications for them. It's just the message with which they are being produced that is dangerous, because what they are demanding is that you accept them uncritically. These artificial wombs are being developed to save really vulnerable babies, ever more premature babies. And who's going to argue and say, no, we shouldn't be developing a device that's going to save the most vulnerable human beings on Earth? You can't argue against that. But you need to be able to look critically about what will happen to the world where this technology exists, and you can have a baby without anyone being pregnant. And the same thing goes for meat grown in labs. There's an incredible desire to find a way out of the terrible ecological catastrophe caused by industrial agriculture. And perhaps this is one way out of it. But for me, it's the most ridiculous overshoot engineering, when in fact we could all just eat a little bit less meat. We could have meat once a week. We could have it twice a week. And I think it says something very interesting about us as a species, that we are so reluctant to give up these comforts, not even comforts, these luxuries of being able to eat meat twice a day, or however much people do, that we would rather go and grow it in a laboratory rather than change the way we eat. And the point is, and cars is a good example. Cars were very, very good for the animal welfare of horses. Horses don't go through terrible things anymore. But there are unintended consequences of relying on technology at every single stage. And the point is, I don't think all technology is bad at all. But I think that we shouldn't use it uncritically, particularly when it is relating to a very intimate aspect of the human experience. And also when we can achieve the ends that the technology is promising us by other means. We need to think, do we want this technology to short circuit this struggle? Or are we prepared to make the changes to human behavior that could arrive at the same point that aren't going to have those unintended consequences?
I suppose one of the things that you mentioned in the book is empowerment. The technology is meant to empower us. But actually, very often we feel, I don't know, speaking for you, but the process of these things coming about, I don't, do I really want them to happen? Well, I don't know. I mean, has it got anything to do with me? I'm not sure. Are we driving the technology, or is commerce and the need for entrepreneurs to make money, and therefore, to bring these things through to fruition? It feels as though it's driven not necessarily by identified need in all cases. Obviously there are parts, certainly in terms of euthanasia, and premature birth, as you think, but is the driving force commerce in technology, in these kind of technologies, or is it need, or is it balance, I suppose?
The driving force is commerce. It's completely commerce, because it's being driven by the private sector and not the public sector, and it's not research scientists involved. And in fact, meat grown in labs is a really good example of that. If it was really for the good of mankind, there would be much more investment of governments in trying to make this happen, so that governments would be producing their own meat. And in fact, you talk about euthanasia, that is completely driven by commerce, because in fact, we do all know of the means for a perfect peaceful death at the time of your choosing. There are euthanizing drugs that are given to people in countries where euthanasia is legal that do provide that. These machines that I talk about in my book exist in countries where it's not legal, and there are people who exploit that in order to make some money themselves, I would say. And so in every case, it is entrepreneurs claiming to be doing great things for humanity, providing companionship for the lonely, setting women free from their biology, or, saving the planet from the terrible carbon emissions caused by industrial agriculture, or even providing comfort to the weak and the ill at the end of their lives. But in fact, they are just motivated either by money, or actually more often than not, by a desire to be the next Steve Jobs and to be famous and to be remembered. Pretty much everyone I interview, all of the entrepreneurs I interview are men, and they all have really, really big egos. In fact, the sex robot manufacturer who I interview in the book, Matt, he creates a very small range of male dolls. There are like 32 female faces, and when I went there were only 3 faces of male dolls, and one of them was sculpted to look exactly like him. So he had an ego big enough to create a male sex doll that people would buy and have sex with, generally men, not women. It looks exactly like him. So, go figure what kind of person.
And he was a failed musician as well, which was...
Yes, he wanted to be a rock star, So all the people I meet in my book want recognition, and they want validation, and they think that the things that they're producing are going to give that to them, but they also want money as well.
Yeah, I suppose that's part of it. And there's also much more. I mean, there's the birth chapter is really quite sinister, and it's sinister for a number of reasons. I mean, I think certainly in terms of sex, the sex robots chapter and the birth chapter, gender looms very large, and the relationships between men and women are so dystopian and dysfunctional that it feels, sort of so far. But then in the birth chapter, you get into this conversation with people on Reddit, and the men who are rejecting women as part of, as a valid part of human existence. That was very sinister stuff. I mean, a lot of people have written about the misogyny that's out there on the internet, but how was it to be so sort of face to face with it?
It was interesting, because when I was actually face to face with it, I was kind of weighing up how much of this misogyny is just theatre to try and entertain other people on Reddit, and how much of it was real. But the thing is, you only need a very small proportion of it to be real for there to be massive real world consequences. And there are a lot of mass shootings that have been linked to incels or men's rights activists and frustrated men who are angry with women and would quite like a world without women. I mean, the forum that I was on Reddit was the MGTOW forum. It's MGTOW, men going their own way, men trying to design a world without women. And they see artificial wombs and sex robots as their key to liberation, because they'll no longer require women for sex or reproduction when these things exist. But for me, with artificial wombs, it was a perfect demonstration of the difference between a perfect world and the real world in which we live. And in a perfect world, these wombs could be used for incredible good. They could be used to help people who can't have children. They can be used to rescue vulnerable babies. But we live in a world where there is an enormous amount of misogyny, where women's reproductive rights are under threat, and where women are constantly judged for inappropriate behavior when they're pregnant. Are you drinking too much? Are you eating the wrong cheese? Are you drinking out of a plastic bottle? Having been pregnant, I know what it is like to feel like you're a kind of human laboratory, and that your duty must be to maximize the outcomes for your baby. And in that world, you can really easily imagine in a world where an artificial womb exists, people saying, you are not behaving like a responsible pregnant person. We are going to outsource your pregnancy to a bit of technology.
Yeah. I mean, you had a video on your website with Sayora, is it? who travels around America, basically giving people who are addicted to drugs, as much as possibly paying for sterilization and IUDs and all that sort of stuff. I mean, the moral and ethical discussions that you had with her seemed very challenging and difficult around how we regard each other, I think, just as human beings, and that sort of idea of a second chance or redemption.
Yeah, so this is Barbara Harris and her charity Project Prevention. Gives drug addicts and alcoholics $300 if they agree to be sterilized. And she's a fascinating character, Barbara, because she's not what you think she's going to be. You think she's going to be this kind of right-wing religious zealot, anti-abortion, and she's not. She's a mother who has adopted 5 children who are all born to the same crack-addicted mother. And she has this very kind of simple, straightforward view, which is these babies shouldn't be being born. Are you prepared to adopt them? If you're not, you should be willing to prevent their births by paying to, by contributing to this cause that will stop them from being born. And it's interesting because from her, I could see myself in her eyes that I was this woolly liberal with too much education who was sitting around saying, oh yes, but what about, the chance of redemption, what if these people change their minds? And she's like, well, if you take drugs, bad things might happen to you, you might get murdered, all these things might happen to you. These are the risks you take when you go down that path in life. And I'm just thinking about the children. And you can see how that's a very seductive line for a lot of people in its simplicity.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's the simplicity that seems to come across in that argument, but also there's another thing about circumventing the problem, where actually, rather than try to do something about drug addiction in communities, you just simply cut the source off.
Exactly.
I mean, it reminded me a bit of Freakonomics and that sort of attitude that Freakonomics have towards abortion, and think, the kind of analysis they give about, well, abortion has actually lowered the crime rate in the 1990s because so many people weren't born after Roe versus Wade, and et cetera, et cetera. So many people in low-income houses, all that sort of stuff. And it does seem, again, that sort of using technology to circumvent issues. Why is it that human beings are so bad at facing up to these things?
Because it requires work. It requires mental energy. It requires tackling difficult questions. And if someone has a sticking plaster which says, I'll just sterilize these people, or hey, you can carry on eating however much meat as you like, we'll just grow it in a lab, that is much more attractive than, I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to ask ourselves some difficult questions, and we're going to have to change the way we do things. We're really slow to change. And I think that change generally happens in a generational way. If I look at my children and the world that they are living in, it is very different from the world that I was born in terms of attitudes, for example, to things like gay marriage. For my son, my son is 7. It's completely normal to him that, a couple might be 2 men who are married, 2 women who are married, or a man and a woman. That's just normal because he's native in that world. Still for me, I'm very supportive of gay marriage, but when you hear of gay people being married, it's like, oh, wow.
Oh, great. Yeah. Well done, man. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's kind of it's a new idea. It's a newfangled thing. So I think we're quite slow at change, and it isn't slow. We're slow, but change doesn't happen in a gradual way. It happens in fits and starts. Someone can make a lot of money if they say, you don't have to change. I've got a machine for that. There's an app for that. Don't worry. And there was so much when I kind of got that idea in my head when I was writing the book, that this is what the book was going to be about, our kind of desire to use technology to circumvent problems we can solve ourselves. I kept seeing so many examples of this, like the kind of epidemic of insomnia and sleeplessness where people get addicted to their phones. And then all of a sudden there are meditation apps you can use to calm yourself down, or hey, you can take melatonin, that will, no, just put your phone down. Or the most striking example for me, which I mentioned in the book, is about when I was doing some of the reporting for the sex robots part of the book, and I was in Las Vegas. I had a really long day of work, and I went back to my hotel totally exhausted, and there was this really loud music being pumped out into the foyer from speakers mounted on the outside of the building in the hotel. And I went up to my hotel room, and I saw that the management, there was a dish next to my bed with all these different kinds of earplugs, of silicone ones and wax ones and foam ones, all these different solutions to the problem of the fact that it was so loud. But the hotel could have just turned the music off. And we're living in a world where we're reliant on different orders of magnitude of complexity to solve the problems caused by the solutions to the last problem.
Yeah,
just saying, you know, we can't have everything we want all at once. You can't go to sleep in a hotel where there is also loud music playing. So it made me think what funny creatures we are. I think aliens looking at us would think that we're quite extraordinary, that we pile on these different levels of solutions instead of tackling the actual root of the problem, which is human desires and human behavior and human problems.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose also I mean, a lot of the, especially in the food part of it, a lot of it, that chapter is about the dangers of technology bubbling through 100 years down the line. So, you know, the idea of kind of industrial agriculture, the idea of antibiotics and what antibiotics could do. I mean, that bit that you wrote about antibiotics in the food chapter is just terrifying, you know, in terms of, you know, most antibiotics are coming to us through meat and through fish and things like that. Very, very terrifying. So it's that sort of sense where we're bringing new technology to solve the problems that we've created with old technology, if that makes sense, you know.
Yes,
layer
absolutely.
upon layer upon layer. When you in this book, you talk to a lot of the producers and the sort of the thinkers who are creating this new technology. Did you talk to anyone who sort of like about the philosophy of science or the, you know, the impact of these things? There's an interesting woman, is she Norwegian, who you speak to, and she, you know, her ideas about the philosophy of how this all fits and where this all fits is very interesting.
Yes.
Do you think that science, I mean, you say something like science, it sounds like there's 3 people in a room, but obviously it's a big thing. But do you think that science polices itself well enough or discusses the philosophies of itself well enough?
I think that when science is publicly funded, it does police itself very well because it is not dependent on hype for its existence. And so it is not trying to gloss over problems. And that's why perhaps one of the most interesting interviews for me in the book is with Mark Post, who's the man who was the first person to grow a burger in a lab. He's the first person to grow and eat it. And if anyone watching is thinking about meat grown in a lab, you're probably thinking about this burger that it was sort of unveiled to great fanfare just under 10 years ago. And it's his burger. And he's really interesting because he is definitely an academic and would much rather have public funding, but it's just not there. So he is part of a startup himself. And he wanted to do things like write papers about experiments that hadn't worked and things that had gone wrong. And his funders didn't want him to make that public, even though he wanted to help all the other people who were trying to grow meat in labs by saying, oh, don't do this, it doesn't work. His funders just saying, no, don't do that. I think scientists are good at policing themselves and each other, and ethicists, when their motivation is science rather than profit. And that's the point, is when you have things that are, where the point of it is to attract greater venture capital investment, you're going to gloss over problems. You're not going to ask those questions about what else might happen when we do this, and do we want that to happen? You're not going to ask those questions. You're going to be absolutely narrowly focused on your goal, which is just getting the product to market.
And so does that put the onus on us as consumers to ask those questions?
Yes, it does. And it puts the onus on us as consumers to ask these questions early, to ask these questions now before these products hit the market, because they are going to hit the market. You know, there's potentially an enormous amount of money to be made for all of them. I mean, you might think, oh, I would never buy a sex robot. Only freaks are going to buy sex robots. Give it 20, 30, 40 years when these things are very, very realistic. People will think...
When I'm in my 70s.
But people will think it's really funny to have, you know, people give these sorts of things to each other as presents.
Yeah.
Before you know it, you are stuck at home in your own echo chamber with this perfect being that is exactly how you want it to look, who always agrees with you and laughs at your jokes. And you'll begin to think, oh, I'm not going to go out and have a conversation with someone who's not going to agree with me. This is a much better way to pass my time. And before you know it, you are becoming a little less good at being human and human interaction because you're having those discussions. So yes, we have to have those conversations early on. It's not that I don't think governments can legislate because, you know, you can't legislate against innovation because we might say, okay, we're not going to make these robots in our country, but that's not going to stop North Korea from doing it.
No.
So we have to, the greatest power that we have as consumers is to not want something. So we have to think very hard in advance about, do we want this? What are the real implications of having it? And if we don't want it, you know, just making that clear, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think, you know, you look at something like Amazon, people love their place and they love their local community and they love, you know, kind of walking down to the shops, whatever it might be. But they also like this, where, you know, they click on a button and it arrives the next day, sort of thing. Or, you know, I mean, Amazon Prime, I think, is this extraordinary thing, you know, the idea that essentially it's there, you know. I mean, I was a teenager who went to record stores all over, you know, like, you know, get a bus to a record store to buy a specific, you know, that sort of thing. And that is now ended as far as I can work out, and that kind of impact of technology, the impact on the high street, the impact on how we live and all that sort of stuff. And I go back to the empowerment point that you make at the end of the book. I think it's very difficult for people to navigate this and to say, well, do I want this? You know, but it's there now, so I may as well. I mean, I think, do you think that the kind of lack of spirit, I don't want to use the word spiritualism, but a kind of philosophy of an idea, like a general idea of what ethics are and values, I suppose. Do you think that that's detrimental to science and to progress? You know,
I think the problems that what we're talking about here are problems of capitalism. You know, they're problems of saying that capitalism assumes that human beings are all self-interested and greedy, and that we're all going to take the shortest shortcut that we possibly can to get what we want with the least amount of effort. And I don't think human beings are selfish and greedy. And I think this past year has shown, you know, the amount that people who are very unlikely to die of COVID, the sacrifices they have made for the sake of people who are, shows that it's possible for human beings to make very rapid change if they think that the need for it is great enough. And also, I don't think, I mean, you talk about Amazon, and I don't think necessarily that you can assume that the direction that we're going in as consumers is unidirectional. There may be, in 10, 20 years, a massive kickback against it. I mean, I'm thinking here about the microwave. You know, in the 80s, when the microwave was invented, I remember how the meals in my home changed when my mother got a microwave, and it was an amazing thing. I don't need to use the oven and do all of this stuff, and then we can have it done. We can buy all these things with plastic on the top, and they'll be ready in 6 minutes. You know, we can make a baked potato in 6 minutes. You know, just things that you would never do now. And that for many years, it was, you know, you felt like this march of technological progress was inevitable. But people will rediscover the values of slow cooking something, doing something in the oven, the value of going to a bookshop or going to I mean, maybe I'm naive for saying this, but I do think you can't necessarily assume that it's just going to get more and more and more and more of everyone doing things online, because people will want to discover things in a different way. There'll be an appetite for that.
It's not always dystopian. I would agree with that, but I would say that there is also and you bring this out in the book, about access and class, I suppose, and those kind of things. You know, these technologies that you're describing in this book will tend to be, if you have the money, then you can access it, and if you don't, well, good luck, sort of thing. And I think that that's maybe where microwaves are. Maybe, you know, maybe we rediscovered because we had more time or more leisure time, or, you know, it was more of an approach where we could afford fresh food. You know, those kind of issues around. I think are really, really well brought out in the book, actually, that access is key to technology and how that works.
Yes.
I mean, did you find that in all the areas of the book?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all going to be elite products, at least at first. I mean, sex robots are very expensive. They're always going to be very expensive. They might get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, but they're never going to be cheap.
Yeah.
Meat grown in labs, the people who are making it say that it's going to be price competitive and taste competitive with meat grown in an animal at some point. Could be within 10 years, could be within 20 years. I have to say that since writing the book, in fact, for the paperback, I've updated the epilogue in the paperback, that they're the first lab-grown meat has been approved for sale and is being sold, and it's being sold in a private members club in Singapore.
Oh, that's
So
nice.
that gives you a little sense of how much of a and the people making it, it's this company Just, whose founder says that he's motivated by having been to Liberia and seeing how people are eating there. He wants to bring good food to everyone. I do not see the people in Liberia biting down on his chicken nuggets.
And the big steak, that's disgusting. That the description that you give of eating that chicken nugget. Have you ever got the taste out of your mouth?
I know, and I've never eaten any breaded meat ever since. I mean, as I said, it might have turned me vegan for all the wrong reasons, eating that chicken nugget. I'm sure it's better now. That was 2 years ago that I ate it. But it is that chicken nugget that's the first ever lab-grown meat approved for sale. And I love this idea that people are in this very exclusive Singapore private members club are eating that nugget, because if it's anything like what I ate, good luck to them.
Yeah. Well, I suppose maybe that's what they pay the money for. You never know what people are into. As the man said in the extract, people's tastes are very specific these days. But I think it is interesting, and I think that there are people exploring this. There was a brilliant film a couple of years ago called Sorry to Miss You, or it was about a call center. And it's the call center set in LA, and then he ends up sort of being taken in by the entrepreneur who runs it, and then they're sort of creating hybrid man horses downstairs and stuff like that. And there is a sense that the ordinary people, the people the what we would call 5/8 in Belfast, kind of regular average Joes, this is happening away from them, and actually that it isn't to improve their lives, it's to make money from kind of people with money. Yes,
absolutely. And also all of the entrepreneurs that I spoke to in the book, they all claim to be doing things for the good of ordinary people.
Yeah.
And that was perhaps the most cynical thing about the whole sex robots business, was that all the people, and there are a lot of different people trying to make these sex robots, it's not just Abyss Creations, but they all say they are trying to provide companionship to people who otherwise would never have it, the lonely, the disabled, the bereaved, the disfigured, the socially awkward. But they're not, because they want a mass market thing. And when I went to the forums where people who want to buy these things congregate, these are not bereaved, lonely people. Some of them have girlfriends. They just really like the idea of having a being that has no autonomy. There's something very cynical about that. There's this suggestion that I'm doing this for the ordinary person. I'm growing this meat so that people in Liberia will be able to have good food, when that in fact you are just trying to find the biggest market possible, and actually any positive message helps with getting venture capital investment, but it's not the real motivator of your project.
No, that sort of false altruism is very difficult and shines through in a lot of the people you speak to as well. I was quite interested in the people who were fighting back against it as well. Kathleen was a very interesting character. I imagine these people come in for ferocious stick on the internet and on things like that. What did you think about her as a voice, as a kind of voice crying in the wilderness against this sort of stuff, or is there?
So with Kathleen, I should say from the start, so Kathleen is an academic from De Montfort University who is the founder of the Campaign Against Sex Robots. And I discovered sex robots because I saw a very little story on the BBC News website which was reporting on her campaign. And this is one of the most fun parts of being a journalist, is when you see a very little story that's completely missed the point in as far as you think. You're like, this is great, because other people are going to think this has been done, but it completely hasn't been done, because the story is not the campaign against sex robots. It's like, people are trying to make sex robots. How can I get into the factory? Who's doing it? What kind of person wants to make one? What kind of person wants to buy one? So anyway, I have a lot to thank Kathleen for, because if it weren't for her campaign, I wouldn't know about any of this. But she is extremely uncompromising. She does not care about what misogynists think of her. And in many ways, she is a kind of straight out of central casting feminist. She doesn't mince her words. She's anti-pornography, she's anti-prostitution, and she's anti-sex robots. And that's all rolled up together as one. And so I've seen her talk at events where a lot of feminists who are very worried about sex robots will turn up to see her talk, and then she will say things like pornography is paid rape because the people involved don't want to be having sex with each other. So if you watch pornography, you are legitimizing paid rape, which just alienates everybody there. But a lot of what she says is quite true. I mean, she looks at sex robots not just in terms of the objectification of women, but also in terms of what it does to the user to be used to having a relationship where all that matters is them. And in many ways, I really agree with her. She just puts her message in such an uncompromising way that it doesn't have the audience that it should do.
I think. It doesn't develop it out. But also, I mean, I suppose, and just before we finish up, I wanted to ask you about the pandemic and just sort of the relationship of science and technology and progress. You know, we're talking about circumventing things. I mean, it's pretty certain. Well, no, I don't actually know this because I'm not a scientist, but it seems pretty certain that the degradation and destruction of animal environments may have led to to this happening, and certainly that's true of SARS and other pandemics or other epidemics that have happened. And we've come up with a vaccine. Hurrah, hurrah, it's a vaccine, wonderful, marvelous. But that does feel, you know, when I read your book and I was thinking about the circumventing issues, it does feel like another example of that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, is that too short-sighted? Is that, you know, I mean, it's very complicated.
I think, you know, coronavirus is a zoonotic disease. It comes from animal populations. It comes from animals that are kept close together in animal agriculture or whose habitats have been destroyed. So these pandemics, they generally happen because they come from animals, and they're able to spread through animals, from animals to humans, because of the way we keep animals in agriculture and sell them. So that is very much the case. And they particularly emerge in, you know, a lot of these SARS-like diseases emerge in Asian markets where they keep really huge numbers of animals together. So I think it's very true to say that. So yes, if we really want a solution to the problem, it's to not keep animals en masse in this way, and to not damage their habitats. But there's also the question of, I think, you know, I said this before, the pandemic has shown how much we can change our behavior and solve problems, both with technology and with changing our behavior. So the vaccine is going to set us free from this, but we are fighting this disease right now by changing our behavior. And we really don't want to change our behavior. Nobody wants this to continue, but it shows how the two go hand in hand. That's the point. And so technology is not the answer. We need both. We need behavioral change and technological change in order to progress. And relying on just technology is a mistake, because, you know, as you say, it's like Barbara Harris paying to sterilize drug addicts. It's not going to stop the problem happening again. That's the whole point. Yeah,
it's just short-term solution to a long-term problem. Well, Jen, what's next? What are you working on? I mean, can you work? Your method is kind of interviewing people in situ, so
it's really hard because so much of my reporting is it's about being in the thick of it and going and talking to people. So I'm not able to do that, and I'm really worried about a world where interviewees expect to be interviewed over Zoom. I want to be able to go into people's factories and workrooms and all the rest. So I'm hoping to write. I have a couple of ideas for books, but they both rely on quite a bit of travel. Right. So I'm not doing the reporting for them at the moment, but I present the breakfast show on Times Radio, the new radio station launched by the Times newspaper. So I do that on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. I get up very early to do that, and I'm writing a whole bunch of pieces and hopefully doing a few podcasts as well, because podcasting is the one thing you really can do.
That's true.
But yeah, I'm really missing getting out and about. I'm missing going to events like this and talking to real people in audiences afterwards. That's how you get ideas. Ideas come from those unforced interactions, and all the fizzing of ideas is what I really miss. I've got lots of ideas, but I'm mourning the ideas that haven't come to be.
Well, yeah, and it does, you were mentioning sort of people having sex robots in the house and becoming less good at being human. It does worry you that you're not, doing that kind of interaction on a regular basis. You're gonna, lose the ability to do it is difficult. So
and lose the inspiration that comes from those random conversations. That's the point.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. So this is the book, everyone, if you can all see that. I believe that the Northern Ireland Science Festival have sorted out a discount with no alibis bookstore, finest independent bookstore on these islands, and doing it online during the lockdown as well. Thank you everyone out there for joining us, and but thanks most of all, Jenny, thanks for your time, thanks for writing the book, and good luck with your future projects.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it, Hugh. Thank you.
Good, thanks.